Have you ever lit a match without thinking twice about it? It's such a small thing, fragile, disposable over in seconds. But what if I told you that this simple object has a dark past, soaked in suffering, silence, and sacrifice? This isn't just about factory work, or toxic chemicals, or corporate greed. This is about teenage girls who were never meant to be remembered. Girls who were used, poisoned, and discarded by the very system that promised them a better life. And yet, they refused to disappear. Today we're digging into the story of the Match Girls of London, a story of resilience, resistance, and quiet revolution. It's painful, it's infuriating, and it's real. This is not just history. This is a warning, and maybe even a spark. Chapter 1. A spark in the darkness. Have you ever lit a match and really thought about it, really thought about it? That tiny flicker of flame we take for granted, just a snap, and it's there. You light a candle, maybe a gas stove, and move on with your day. But that little stick, that's a piece of history, a symbol of survival, of warmth, of danger. And in one very specific chapter of the past, a symbol of pain. It's strange how something so small, so seemingly harmless, once carried the power to destroy lives. And I'm not speaking metaphorically here. There was a time when a simple match could literally rot your face away. Your skin, your bones, your breath. All taken from you, slowly, painfully, and in silence. This isn't a horror story. It's not a metaphor for corporate greed. Well, not just a metaphor. It really happened. To hundreds of women. Maybe more. I first stumbled on this story by accident reading about factory workers in Victorian England. It started with a headline, "The Match Girls' Strike" of 1888. At first, it sounded like just another labor protest buried in the dusty corners of history. But then I kept reading. And what I found? It shook me. Young girls, some as young as 12, spent their days dipping tiny wooden sticks into a glowing chemical called white phosphorus. It made the matches burn brighter. It also made their jawbones rot from the inside out. They called it Phossy Jaw, a name that sounds almost childish, like a dance move or a toy. But what it really meant was slow, visible death, often starting with a toothache and ending with a shattered face. No one warned them. No one stopped it. In fact, the people who ran these factories knew exactly what was happening and chose profit over protection, again and again. And yet, despite everything they endured, these women, these so-called match girls, fought back. Their story isn't just about disease or injustice. It's about courage, resistance, and the power of standing together even when the whole world looks away. So today I want to share that story with you. Not because it's easy to hear, but because it matters. Because behind every match we strike, there's a spark from the past, one we should never forget. Let's go back to where it all began. Chapter 2. A World Built on Ashes. To really understand what happened to the Match Girls, we have to step back to a different world, Victorian England, the mid-1800s. Now, if you've ever watched those dreamy period dramas with corsets and candlelight, you probably imagine carriages rolling down cobblestone streets, men in top hats tipping them politely, and women whispering behind lace fans at lavish parties. That's the version they want us to remember. But the truth, it was brutal, especially if you were born poor. At the time, Britain was deep in the Industrial Revolution, and that revolution didn't feel like progress for most people. It felt like survival. Factories were popping up everywhere. The rich were getting richer, and everyone else, they were just trying to stay alive. There were really only two options if you weren't born into wealth. You worked, or you starved. And for working-class families, that meant everyone had to pitch in: men, women, children. Sometimes even toddlers. There was no such thing as childhood the way we think of it today. If you could stand, you could sweep. If you could reach, you could package. It didn't matter if you were 6 years old or 16, you were part of the workforce. Most of these jobs were in factories. Loud, dangerous, toxic factories. And there were no labor laws, no unions, no safety regulations. If you lost a finger or an eye or your life, there was always someone else waiting to take your place. You were disposable. Just another cog in the machine. That was the world the match girls were born into. Most of them were Irish immigrants or daughters of the working poor. Many couldn't read or write. They lived in overcrowded slums, slept 3 or 4 to a bed, and woke before dawn to make it to the match factory on time. And if they were late, they were fined. If they talked back, fined. If they got sick, replaced. It wasn't just unfair, it was cruel by design. And yet, what's so haunting to me is how normal it all seemed back then. No one blinked. This was just how life worked. A factory job was considered lucky, a stable income, a future. Even if that future meant watching your coworkers waste away from something they couldn't even name yet, it's easy now sitting here in our modern comforts to wonder why they didn't just walk away. But where would they have gone? Who would have taken them in? No one was hiring poor Irish girls with no education and missing teeth. Their families depended on their wages. Without that job, there was no food, no shelter, no hope. So they kept showing up, to a place that was slowly killing them. And the men who owned those factories, they knew. They saw it happening, and they made a fortune anyway. But this isn't just about the working class or factory conditions or even poverty. It's about how entire systems are built to keep certain people silent, invisible. And the match girls. They were supposed to stay invisible too, but they didn't. And that's where their story really starts. Chapter 3. The Business of Burning Bright. So let's talk about the matchmakers behind the match girls, and I don't mean the romantic kind. The company at the center of all this was called Bryant and May. Sounds fancy, right? Like a law firm or a department store. But they didn't sell silk or perfume. They sold fire. Back in the 1850s, William Bryant and Frances May saw an opportunity, a big one. Because before electricity, before gas lighters, before even reliable stoves, matches were everything. You needed them to light candles to heat your home to cook dinner. No matches, no warmth, no food, no light. So naturally, whoever controlled the match industry had power, and Bryant and May knew that. They started by importing matches from Sweden, specifically what were called safety matches. Safer, because they only lit when struck against a special surface. Seemed like a great idea. But eventually, importing got expensive, and the profits weren't high enough. So they decided to start manufacturing their own matches in London. And here's where things take a turn. In 1861, they bought the rights to a different kind of match, a match that could strike anywhere. On a wall, on a table, even on your shoe. Convenient, absolutely. Safe, not at all. These matches were coated in a substance called white phosphorus. And yes, even back then, people knew this stuff wasn't good. There were already warnings, instructions not to inhale, labels that hinted at danger, but most people ignored it. Because white phosphorus made matches burn bright without the nasty sulfur smell people were used to. That was the trade-off, a nicer scent in exchange for a slow, invisible poison. And just like that, Bryant and May became one of the most successful match companies in the world. They built a massive factory in East London, hired thousands of workers. They made so much money they didn't just expand their operations, they started dominating the market. But success has a price. And in this case, the price was paid by women and girls and children. Because while Bryant and May were lighting up parlors and dining rooms all across Europe, their workers were being slowly poisoned behind factory walls. And here's the thing that gets me. This wasn't a secret. The owners knew the risks. They knew what white phosphorus could do. There were alternatives, like red phosphorus, which was safer, but it was more expensive. And expense meant less profit. So instead of protecting their workers, they doubled down. They pushed production harder, hired more girls, ignored the smell, the headaches, the bleeding gums, and they kept the fire burning. To the outside world, Bryant and May were pioneers, industrial leaders, visionaries. But inside the factory, they were just men getting rich while young girls died quietly in the shadows, and no one was going to stop them. Not the government, not the inspectors, not the newspapers. Because as long as the profits were good and the matches kept selling, no one wanted to look too closely. But the girls, they knew. Their bodies knew. And eventually, they decided to speak. Chapter 4. Inside the match factory, I used to think hell was just a metaphor, a place invented to scare people into behaving. But the more I learned about what went on inside the Bryant and May Factory, the more I realized that for thousands of girls, hell was real. And it was built by men in suits. Imagine this. You're 12 years old, maybe 13 if you're lucky. You wake up before the sun throw on the same clothes you wore yesterday, and every day before that, then walk through the cold streets of East London to get to work. You don't go to school. You don't get breakfast. You don't even really get to be a child, because the factory doesn't wait for you. And if you're late, they'll fine you again. That was the daily routine for so many girls working at Bryant and May. Most of them were poor Irish or both. They came from overcrowded tenement homes, families too big for one income, and neighborhoods the rest of London didn't want to look at. Their only option was to work. And for girls, the match factory was the best bad choice they had. It sounds strange now, but back then, working in a match factory was considered a decent job for a working class girl. Regular hours, steady pay, though barely enough to survive. But what they didn't tell you, what they deliberately hid, was the cost. Inside the factory, conditions were brutal. Long hours, often 12 to 14 a day. No proper ventilation, no safety measures, and absolutely no protection from the toxic chemicals that hung in the air like a fog. The girls worked standing up hunched over trays of matchsticks, dipping each one into white phosphorus paste. The fumes were constant, thick, sharp. They clung to your hair, your clothes, your skin, and no one wore gloves, no masks, not even a rag to cover their face. Worse, they were forced to eat inside the factory right there at their workstations. That means they were handling their food with the same hands they used to handle the phosphorus. Day after day, bite after bite. Inhaling, touching, absorbing poison they didn't even know was killing them, and the pay barely enough to keep a roof over your head. And from that tiny wage, they still had to pay for their own tools. Glue string, even the fuel for the little machines. It all came out of their pockets. And if you spoke up, if you complained or asked for help, or even just cried too loudly, you were fined or hit or fired. Supervisors kept the girls in line through physical punishment, slaps, shoves, sometimes worse. And they got away with it, because nobody cared what happened to poor girls behind factory walls. And still, they stayed because they had to. They needed the money. Their families needed the money. And deep down, I think some of them hoped it wouldn't happen to them, that the rumors about girls losing their teeth or coming home with swollen faces were exaggerated. But the bodies don't lie. And after a while, even the strongest girls couldn't ignore what was happening. They were getting sick. Not just tired or overworked, but sick in a way that felt wrong. In a way that couldn't be fixed with rest or tea or prayers. And what happened next was something no one should ever have to endure. Chapter 5. The Rot. Beneath the surface. It started with a toothache. That's how most of the girls described it. Just a dull, throbbing pain. Nothing too serious at first. And honestly, in a place like the Bryant and May Factory, who had time to worry about a little toothache, you worked through it. You had to, but soon the pain would get sharper, more intense. Then the swelling would start, not just in the gums, but all along the jaw, sometimes the cheek, sometimes both sides of the face. And when it got really bad, the smell would come. That's what haunted me when I first read about it. The smell. It wasn't something you could cover up or pretend wasn't there. The girls who got sick, their bodies began to emit this thick, garlicky stench. It wasn't from bad hygiene. It was from their bones literally rotting from the inside out. What they were experiencing was something doctors at the time didn't even fully understand. They just started calling it Phossy Jaw. And if that sounds clinical, trust me, the reality was anything but. The white phosphorus used in the matches what the girls touched every day, breathed in, ate with, slept in, was a slow poison. It seeped into their systems quietly, invisibly. It would sit in the bloodstream, settle into the bones, and begin to destroy from within. First, their teeth would fall out. Then their gums would develop open sores, and eventually, the lower jaw flesh bone tissue would begin to disintegrate. Not metaphorically, literally. Some of the girls would wake up with abscesses so swollen they couldn't speak. Others had to quit eating solid food entirely because their jaws had become too fragile, too painful, or had simply collapsed. In the worst cases, the bone would glow faintly in the dark, a sick, almost supernatural green. They were dying, piece by piece, and they knew it. What made it all so much worse was how long it took. Phossy Jaw didn't strike overnight. It crept up slowly over months, sometimes years, which meant these girls were forced to watch themselves fall apart, powerless, in pain, and surrounded by others just like them. No one helped. The factory didn't step in. There were no medical teams, no nurses, no aid. In fact, Bryant and May did everything they could to deny it was happening. They told the girls it was their own fault, that it was poor hygiene, that they must have had bad teeth before they even started working there. And when the girls started asking questions or showing signs of sickness, the company's solution was to pull their teeth out. Yes. They literally had a policy of yanking out the teeth of any worker who complained of jaw pain, claiming it was preventative. And if you refused, you were fired. Can you imagine being 16 years old knowing your body is betraying you and your only options are silence or unemployment? It's heartbreaking, and it's infuriating, because all of it, every lost tooth, every infected jaw, every young woman disfigured or buried, it was all preventable. They knew the cause, they knew the symptoms, and they had a safer alternative, red phosphorus. But it cost a little more, so they didn't switch. They let girls rot from the inside out to save money, and I think that's the part that never stops bothering me. Not just the sickness, not just the suffering, but how normal it became. Girls would vomit on the walk home. Others couldn't afford shoes and went barefoot even as their bones decayed. Some were so poor they hid the pain for as long as they could because even dying was better than losing that meager paycheck. But the thing about silence, it doesn't last forever. And the match girls were done being quiet. Chapter 6. The silence breaks. For years the girls endured. They worked, they got sick, they watched their friends disappear, and they stayed quiet because silence felt safer than starving. But pain has a way of piling up, and eventually it overflows. By the 1880s, Bryant and May had grown into a booming business. They employed over 1,000 workers, most of them women and girls. They were making money hand over fist. The matchboxes sold like wildfire, ironic really, and the factory owners basked in their success like nothing was wrong. But something was very, very wrong, and people outside the factory were finally starting to notice. It didn't start with the government. Of course not. And it didn't start with a whistleblower or a brave manager. It started with a journalist, a woman named Annie Besant. Annie wasn't rich. She wasn't part of the factory system. But she had one powerful tool, her voice. She was a writer and activist, and maybe most importantly, she believed working-class women deserved to be heard. She had heard rumors about the match factories, the fines, the abuse, the illness, the missing teeth, and instead of dismissing it, she went to see for herself. She spoke to the workers, she listened, and then she wrote. In 1888, Annie Besant published an article titled White Slavery in London. That title was loud, it was provocative, it was meant to shock, and it did. But the content, it was even more powerful. She described everything, the toxic fumes, the phossy jaw, the hunger, the forced silence, the fines for being late, the threats of punishment. She exposed the entire operation and called it what it was, exploitation, brutal, systematic, unforgivable, and for the first time the public listened. People were horrified. They couldn't believe that such cruelty was happening in their own city. In London, in a factory that made something as mundane as matches. The article spread quickly, and so did the outrage. But Bryant and May weren't going down without a fight. Instead of acknowledging the suffering, they attacked Annie. They accused her of lying. They threatened to sue. They even forced their workers to sign statements saying everything in the article was false. And just like that, the girls were backed into a corner again. Sign the paper, deny the truth, or lose your job. Most of them signed, but not all of them. One girl, Sarah Chapman, refused. She wasn't loud. She wasn't famous. But her refusal changed everything. Because when she walked out of the factory that day, 14 other girls followed her. And what started as one quiet act of resistance became a wave. That was the spark. That was the moment the Match Girls went from victims to fighters. They didn't have money, they didn't have power, but they had truth. And now finally they had people watching. The silence had been broken, and there was no going back. Chapter 7. The Strike Heard. Across London. You know how sometimes all it takes is one person to say, enough, and suddenly everything starts to shift. That's exactly what happened in the summer of 1888. When Sarah Chapman walked out of Bryant and May, she wasn't leading a revolution. She was just a young woman who'd had enough of being lied to, enough of being silenced, enough of watching people around her rot from the inside, while the men upstairs smoked cigars in clean offices. She wasn't alone for long. 14 girls followed her out the door, and within days, over 1,000 workers had joined them. Just like that, the Match Girls' strike had begun. And look, this wasn't some organized, strategic labor movement. These were teenage girls. Most had never even spoken in public before, let alone challenged a corporate empire. They had no union, no legal support, no experience in protest. But what they did have was clarity. They knew what was happening inside those factory walls, and now the public did too. The press picked up Annie Besant's story. More newspapers ran headlines. Donations started pouring in coins and bills from people across the city who couldn't stomach the thought of girls being poisoned for profit. It was the first time, maybe ever, that the working-class women of London weren't invisible, and Bryant and May. They panicked. Production halted. Profits dropped. They tried to hire replacement workers, but no one wanted to cross a picket line full of sick girls holding signs with missing teeth and scarred jaws. It was too real, too human to ignore. Still, the company refused to admit any wrongdoing. They wouldn't even say the word phosphorus. So the girls went further. They organized. They formed a strike committee led by Sarah Chapman and a handful of others who'd never led anything before, but who understood that if they didn't take control of their own fight, no one would. And then in one of the boldest moves of the entire strike, a group of Match Girls marched to Parliament. Just imagine that for a second. Poor working-class teenage girls, most of them covered in scars, walking into the halls of government to testify, to speak for themselves, to tell the men in power exactly what had been done to them. And you know what people listened. Not everyone, of course. Some politicians dismissed them as dramatic or emotional. But others, real people with real hearts, saw them. They heard the tremble in their voices, the exhaustion in their stories. And they knew this was more than a labor dispute. This was a crisis of conscience. Support grew, the pressure mounted. And finally, after 3 brutal weeks, Bryant and May backed down. They agreed to many of the girls' demands: pay raises, an end to unfair fines, a separate lunchroom away from the toxic chemicals, and most importantly, they offered to rehire every single girl who had walked out. It wasn't everything. It didn't erase the years of suffering. It didn't bring back the girls who had died. But it was a victory, a real one. And for once, the headlines didn't belong to the men in power. They belonged to the Match Girls, the ones who lit the flames both literally and figuratively, and then used that fire to fight back. Chapter 8. What Victory Left Behind. When the strike ended, the girls went back to work. That sentence feels strange to say out loud. After everything, the protests, the headlines, the parliament hearings, they still had to walk back through those same factory doors, same building, same machines, same men in charge. But something had changed. They weren't just workers anymore. They were survivors, fighters, organizers. And for the first time in British history, working-class women formed their own union. They called it the Union of Women Matchmakers. It wasn't big, it wasn't rich, but it was powerful in ways that scared the people who used to control them. Eventually, the union expanded to include male workers, too, and became the Matchmakers Union. It laid the groundwork for future labor movements. It inspired gas workers, dock workers, textile workers, ordinary people who had always been told to sit down and stay quiet, and yet, the victory wasn't complete, because while Bryant and May agreed to better wages and working conditions, they didn't agree to stop using white phosphorus, not right away. Despite everything that had come to light, despite the very public suffering of the girls, despite safer alternatives being available, they kept using the same toxic chemical for years, and girls kept getting sick. The union gave them more bargaining power. It gave them some dignity, some leverage, but it couldn't undo the damage that had already been done. It couldn't replace a jawbone. It couldn't erase the pain. Between the end of the strike in 1888 and the eventual government intervention in the early 1900s, more than a dozen women died of Phossy Jaw. And those are just the ones we know about. Most cases were never recorded. There were no public obituaries, no compensation. These girls didn't become martyrs. They just disappeared. And the factory Bryant and May didn't stop using white phosphorus until 1901, not because of conscience, but because a cheaper, safer chemical finally became available. Let that sink in. After decades of preventable deaths, disfigurements, and silence, they only changed course when it made more financial sense. That part stings the most. Because it reminds you that no matter how brave the workers were, no matter how loud the public became, some companies only listen when their bottom line is on the line. But even so, the Match Girls' story didn't end with tragedy. Their strike was the spark that lit a movement. It proved that young working-class women girls, who weren't supposed to matter, could stand up to power and make it flinch. They didn't win everything. They didn't walk away whole. But they walked away together. And that changed everything. In a world that tried to chew them up and throw them away, they built something bigger than the factory walls. They built a legacy. Chapter 9, Echoes Through Time. You'd think that after everything after the strike, the press, the protests, and the public support, there'd be sweeping change, that someone in power would finally step in and say enough. But as it so often goes in history, change didn't come in a wave. It trickled in, slowly, painfully, and far too late for too many. It wasn't until 1893, 5 full years after the Match Girls' strike, that the British government finally did something. They passed a regulation requiring match factories to be licensed and inspected. They also mandated better ventilation and sanitation, which sounds like the bare minimum, because it was. But here's the thing, even with new laws on paper, Bryant and May still kept using white phosphorus. They knew it caused Phossy Jaw. They knew it had already killed workers. But they kept going for 7 more years. It wasn't until 1901 that they finally stopped, and not because they were forced to, not because of guilt or moral reckoning, but because a cheaper chemical finally came along, one that didn't cut into their profits the way red phosphorus did. That's what finally ended the era of Phossy Jaw, not activism, not regulation, but cost-effectiveness. It's infuriating when you think about it, that human lives were weighed against margins, that young girls were buried before anyone in power lifted a finger, and even when they did lift a finger, it was more of a shrug than a swing. But even with all that, I don't think the Match Girls lost, because what they sparked reached far beyond the factory walls. Their strike, their refusal to stay silent, was one of the very first organized industrial protests led by women in British history. And it worked. It proved that working-class people, even without money or formal education, could organize, could speak, could disrupt the system. And they weren't alone for long. Their movement inspired a wave of labor, unrest across the country. Gas workers, dock workers, miners, seamstresses. One by one, groups, who had once been invisible, realized they could make themselves seen. They could fight for fair wages, for safety, for dignity. And in time, those small sparks built the foundation for something bigger, the modern labor movement. Unions, workers' rights, safety standards. Those things didn't just appear out of thin air. They were fought for, earned. And in many ways born in a match factory where girls were told to stay quiet. I think about that a lot. about how many people today go to work in safer, more humane conditions, never knowing that part of the reason why is because a few teenage girls in 1888 refused to look the other way. The girls who lit the matches also lit the fire. And even though time has passed, their story still matters. Because exploitation hasn't gone away, it's just changed shape. And somewhere out there right now, someone is still working through pain, still afraid to speak up, still wondering if their life is worth less than the product they help make. And maybe if they hear this story, they'll know they're not alone, that someone once stood up and changed everything. Chapter 10. The Light. They left behind. When I first started researching the Match Girls, I thought I was just going to tell a dark, forgotten story from history. One of those tales that make you shake your head and go, how did this happen? But somewhere along the way, it stopped feeling like history and started feeling familiar. Because this wasn't just a story about Victorian England or industrial greed or a factory tucked away in East London. This was about people. People who were supposed to be invisible. People who were told they didn't matter. People who were used up, tossed aside, and expected to be quiet about it. And yet, they weren't quiet. That's the part that stays with me. These girls, some of them barely teenagers, risked everything to tell the truth. When no one believed them. When no one wanted to listen. When the cost of speaking up was losing the only thing they had a job that was slowly killing them. They spoke anyway. And even though they didn't get justice in the way we often imagine it, they didn't see their bosses go to jail or win millions in compensation or become celebrities. They won something else. Something bigger. They won the right to be heard. They won the right to say, this is not okay. And they lit the way for others to do the same. Their courage wasn't loud. It wasn't glamorous. It looked like holding hands on a factory floor. It looked like refusing to sign a lie. It looked like walking into Parliament in secondhand shoes with no jaw and saying, I still matter. And that kind of bravery, it ripples. It ripples through time, through generations, through industries and countries and movements. It reminds us that the systems we live under aren't immovable, that the power structures we're told are too big to fight aren't. It reminds us that the quietest voices can still shake foundations. And as I sit here now telling you this story more than a century later, I can't help but wonder who today is still being asked to stay silent, who's being overworked, underpaid, and told that's just the way it is. Maybe it's someone working in a warehouse. Maybe it's a woman behind a cash register. Maybe it's a teenager in a sweatshop on the other side of the world. Whoever they are. I hope they hear this story. I hope we hear it. Because the Match Girls didn't just fight for themselves. They fought for anyone who's ever been told they're replaceable. They proved that even the smallest spark under the right conditions can burn through a mountain of injustice. And today, long after the flames of their matches have gone out, their light still reaches us. If you're still here, thank you. Thank you for sitting with this story, for listening not just to the facts, but to the people inside them. The Match Girls didn't have social media. They didn't have lawyers or unions, at least not at first. What they had was each other, and a truth that was too painful to stay buried. Their story reminds me, and maybe reminds you too, that silence is never neutral. It protects the powerful. It punishes the vulnerable. And sometimes the bravest thing we can do is speak. If this episode moved you, taught you something new, or even just made you pause, I'd love to hear your thoughts. Drop a comment below. Share this with someone who needs to hear it, and remember, sometimes the smallest voices carry the loudest echoes. You've been watching True Crime Echoes. I'll see you in the next one.